Good evening, everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes to let everybody join, and then we'll get started. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening for our second meeting of the Colorado Clean Trucking Strategy. Tonight we're going to be discussing the medium and heavy duty vehicle study that was recently completed. Before I start, I just wanted to make people aware that we have an option for live Spanish interpretation this evening. So if you would prefer to listen to a Spanish language audio channel, you can switch to that now.
Buenas noches, gracias por unirse a esta reunión acerca de la estrategia de camiones ecológicos para analizar el estudio de vehículos medianos y pesados. Si desean escuchar interpretación en vivo que tenemos esta noche para esta sesión, con gusto le pueden dar al botón para meterse en el canal de español en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla.
So my name is Michael King. I work at the Colorado Department of Transportation in our Office of Innovative Mobility. And we're joined tonight by representatives of our partner agencies, the Colorado Energy Office, and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We have Will Torr, the Executive Director of the Colorado Energy Office, Sean McGrath, the Director of Environmental Programs at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. We have Steve McCannon, who is the Mobile Sources Program Director, I believe, at CDPHE, close. And we have Kate Kelly, who is the Chief of Innovative Mobility at CDOT. So all of our participants tonight are automatically muted. If you've pre-registered to make a comment or to speak, the host, myself, will unmute you for your public comment at the right time. If possible, please update your participant name in the Zoom so that we can recognize who to unmute at the right time. If you're not able to update your name in Zoom, you can just use the raise hand feature or make a comment either in the Q&A box or the chat box to let us know that you're present if we're not able to find you. If you did not register to make a public comment in advance, but you'd like to, you can also indicate that in the Q&A box or in the chat box. If you have a question that you would like the panelists to address, you can put that in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to all of those questions today during our meeting, but if not, we'll follow up individually with people with the answers to those questions after the meeting. And we'll also update our frequently asked questions document that we've been maintaining for this clean trucking strategy effort on our website. I already mentioned that interpretation will be available today. So in addition to that being an option for you as a participant, I would also encourage people as they're making comments or if they're speaking at some other point in the meeting to try to speak slowly and clearly to allow the interpreters to catch everything that you're saying and translate it for the Spanish-speaking audience. In terms of a few ground rules for the meeting, we ask everybody to help create space for new voices to be heard. We'd like to keep comments brief and to the point as much as possible. We ask you to treat each other with respect and avoid any harsh language, personal attacks, or the like. We're all trying to solve problems together, and so we appreciate a cordial conversation. So our meeting agenda for this evening, we've already gone over some of the guidelines for participation. Next, we will turn it over to Kay Kelly, who will present on the findings of the study, the medium and heavy duty study, and how this fits into our broader clean trucking strategy. After that, we'll go through the public comment period for those of you that signed up in advance or decide during the meeting that you'd like to make a comment. After that, we'll have a short break. Then we'll go to questions and answers. And finally, we'll talk about some next steps and close the meeting for the evening. So with that, I will turn it to Kay to talk about the clean trucking strategy and the medium and heavy duty study.
Thanks, Mike. And thank you also to the attendees on the Zoom tonight. We really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to participate in this webinar and this process. The state team and I are very much looking forward to your feedback during the public comment session. So it's my job tonight to take you through a 150-page analysis study in about 30 minutes. So we'll go ahead and dive right into that. I'll start just by recognizing that the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector is complex and challenging. There's a lot of variety in the jobs that these vehicles do, and the stakes are also quite high because all of us depend on these vehicles to do that job. They deliver our goods and services, they keep our economy moving, and they aren't just trucks. They're very much a tool for the large and small businesses across the state who use them every day to perform a job. So, there are growing numbers of zero emission vehicles coming onto the market. We aren't yet at a place where every single weight class and application has a readily available zero emission option. We know that the transition needs to happen carefully, and we know that we need a lot of input from stakeholders to manage it. So the technical analysis that we're going to be discussing today, along with the stakeholder engagement we're planning over the coming weeks and months, are going to be really key to designing something that strikes that balance between the critical role that these medium and heavy duty vehicles play in our daily lives, and our need as a state and as a community to take bold action to address the pollution that they're causing. So next slide. So we know that medium and heavy duty vehicles are contributing in an outsized way to air pollution. That air pollution is both greenhouse gas emissions and ozone precursor emissions. Those are things like particulate matter, or PM, as you'll hear it referred to in the presentation tonight, and oxides of nitrogen, or NOx. So medium and heavy duty vehicles are only 9% of our registered vehicles in the state, but they're responsible for 22% of our transportation greenhouse gas emissions, 30% of our on-road NOx emissions, and 40% of our on-road particulate matter emissions. And on the next slide, we also know that disproportionately impacted communities are more likely to live near highways and near freight routes, and that the pollution coming from these vehicles is really having a detrimental effect on the health and the lives of the folks in these communities. Next slide. So Colorado's greenhouse gas roadmap, which was released in January, showed that we need to reduce greenhouse gases in the transportation sector by about 13 million tons by 2030 in order to reach our state climate targets. We've made some really significant progress already. We've done that through low and zero emission vehicle rules on the light duty side, transportation investments, both from the state and from our utilities. But we still have about a 4.7 million ton gap left to make up. So tackling pollution from the medium and heavy duty vehicle sector and developing this Colorado clean truck strategy is one of the areas where we can make some additional progress and continue chipping away at that gap. So as I've been saying, medium and heavy duty a lot. Before we get too much further into the presentation, I'll pause and really define what that means. So both the Federal Highway Administration and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency define on-road vehicle classes based on the gross vehicle weight rating, or GVWR. And that's the maximum weight of the vehicle itself, the fluids in that vehicle, plus passengers and cargo. So what you see on the screen here is everything that would be considered a medium or heavy duty vehicle for today's discussion. So basically, everything over 8,500 pounds. And we are talking about on-road vehicles, not any off-road vehicles. So, really starting with those full-size pickup trucks, you'll recognize those as something like an F-250, a Silverado, or Ram 2500 series, all the way up to the biggest vehicles in the Class 8 market, the semi-tractors and things like that. Next slide. So I've also been referring to zero emission vehicles, or ZEV. So I'll define those as well. When we talk about ZEV, we're referring to electric vehicles powered exclusively by batteries. Those are called battery electric vehicles. We're also talking about vehicles powered partially by batteries that can be plugged in and partially by an internal combustion engine. These types of vehicles are called plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Also on the list are electric vehicles powered by hydrogen fuel. Those are called fuel cell electric vehicles. In addition, there are renewable fuels like recovered methane, which is also known as renewable natural gas. And those are vehicles that can be considered zero emissions depending on how that fuel is produced and if it's produced in a zero emission fashion. In the medium and heavy duty sector, things like hybrid refrigeration units that can be plugged in at loading docks instead of idling during deliveries can also be considered zero emission. So next slide, we kicked off this clean truck strategy process a little over a year ago when Colorado signed onto a multi-state memorandum of understanding for zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicles. Last fall, we convened a series of public listening sessions, and we also engaged MJ Bradley and Associates to do a technical analysis of both the national and the Colorado specific medium and heavy duty markets to really help us understand all the pathways that we have to tackling this complex sector of transportation. So after nearly a year's work, we released that analysis study on October 6th, and we're now holding more public listening sessions. This is our second session today, and we'll have one more next weekend. And these sessions are really intended to go through the findings from that study and accept additional public input. The analysis study we just published, along with the stakeholder input that we'll be collecting over the coming weeks and months, are going to inform an eventual Colorado clean truck strategy, which we hope to have published sometime in February. And that strategy is going to help us with our next steps. The AQCC does have a placeholder on their long-term calendar for a potential request for rulemaking hearing on the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule in May of 2022 as well. So next slide. I know that many people did participate in the listening sessions last fall. So I wanted to point out a few changes that have happened in the state in the last year. So first is the passage of Senate Bill 260, which is going to be providing $724 million in new fee revenue that's going to support 3 zero-emission transportation enterprises in the state. One of those enterprises is focused on transit. Another is focused on all other fleet vehicles other than transit. And then a community access enterprise, which is focused on the fueling and charging infrastructure for all zero-emission vehicles. We also have had some large investments by utilities such as Xcel. We also have funding that will flow from the federal government through the recently passed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And then finally, the governor's budget proposal for next fiscal year also includes some funding, $150 million for school bus electrification and $15 million for cleaner trucks. So a lot of great funding resources at our disposal to help start tackling this challenge. From here, we're going to move into the study results, and we'll start with the national overview. So the first slide in this section is really just some fast facts about the national medium and heavy duty fleet. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. So again, vehicle diversity. Trucks are designed to do a specific job. They're purpose-built for that particular job. They're also on the road for a long time. The average life of a medium and heavy duty vehicle is about 30 years. but they do drive 90% of their miles by the 20-year mark. So once they hit 20 years, the annual mileage does start to decline. Very few fleets purchase and own new trucks. These vehicles move frequently from one owner to another, and many fleets choose to lease their vehicles instead of owning them. Truck fleets tend to be quite small. 80% of fleets have 6 or fewer trucks, and this has an impact on the risk tolerance of fleets since they don't have spare vehicles. So, if they encounter something unexpected with a new technology, that vehicle just simply doesn't go out on the road to do its job that day, and that can have a detrimental impact on that business. Despite having lots of vehicle types, the medium and heavy duty industry is actually a very consolidated industry. 95% of the class 4 through 8 vehicles are made by a handful of manufacturers. And in the class 2B3 market, the majority of those vehicles are sold by the American big three, those being Ford, GM, and Stellantis. And then finally, there are also a lot of trucks sold as incomplete vehicles where a primary manufacturer, like one of the ones I just mentioned, sends that vehicle to someone else, and then they add a vocational body to it before it actually enters the market. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, zero emission vehicles are in various stages of readiness, with some applications like transit available today, and with an increasing number of offerings coming into the market in the medium duty space, particularly in the delivery sector. Things like heavy regional freight and long haul are further out on the time horizon, but even these sectors are showing promise for having vehicle availability early in the next decade, the 2030 to 2035 timeframe. Next slide. So transit bus markets are the furthest along. About 13% of transit agencies in the US are already moving in this direction. 1/3 of them have committed to going all zero emission by 2045. And every North American manufacturer of diesel buses currently has a zero emission offering on the market. Not to mention some specific manufacturers who are producing only electric vehicles as well. School buses aren't that far behind, and in fact are a larger market than transit because school buses outnumber transit 5 to 1. Next slide. So cost is something that we hear about a lot when we're talking about medium and heavy duty vehicles. The upfront purchase price for zero emission options are currently more expensive, but they are projected to decrease as these vehicles see higher volume manufacturing. So in the class 2B3 market, you can see that red line, dropping pretty quickly to match up with the blue line, which is the conventional diesel alternative. So you can see that incremental cost differential is going to go away fairly rapidly, having the ZEV options reach price parity by early in the next decade, particularly on the lighter side of medium and heavy duty. Next slide. So charging, where these vehicles charge is also a consideration. You can see here that a lot of these vehicles drive predictable routes and return to a depot or a home base every night. And they have 7 to 10 hours available per day to plug in. Those are use cases that are pretty straightforward for designing and installing charging infrastructure. In other cases, though, drivers might take their work vehicles home at night, or they might travel long distances, cross-country routes. And in those cases, they would require use of public charging stations instead of depot stations. And when we're talking about that furthest right-hand column here for the long-haul Class 8 tractors, those are going to rely on public charging. They don't have long dwell times in any one location, and they do require a higher charging rate. So that's a use case that's currently the most challenging. Battery technology and fuel cell technology even are, advancing very rapidly. But you can see why this particular application is a little farther out on the time horizon just because of the multiple challenges that are involved. So that's the national picture. Let's zoom in here to the Colorado specific data. So we do have nearly 500,000 registered medium and heavy duty vehicles in our state. The vast majority of them, 80%, are in the Class 2B3 segment of the market. Class 4 through 6 accounts for 9% of vehicles, and the heaviest weight classes, Class 7 and 8, are at 11% of the market. And the next few slides are going to show some maps. You can see geographically where the vehicles are located in the state. So this is the Class 2B3 map, and as you can see, the vehicles are spread pretty ubiquitously across the state. Doesn't appear to be highly correlated to fleets. So we do think that a very large portion of these are either personal vehicles or they're owned by very small commercial fleets, because they're literally spread pretty evenly across the state. Moving to the next map, this is Class 4 through 6. Again, this is a little, quite a bit smaller segment of vehicles. We do see pockets of vehicles near population centers, along the Front Range, obviously, and along our freight routes. And then the next map shows Class 7 and 8. Same story here as the 4 through 6 map, but slightly larger numbers of vehicles near those population centers and along the freight routes. And then there's one final map in here. This is a map showing our truck volumes and truck traffic volumes and truck stops. And you can certainly, see some correlation here, especially for the 4 through 6 and Class 7 through 8 geographic distributions of where the vehicles are located. So another interesting point we gleaned by looking at the annual mileage data for these trucks is that the Class 2B3s aren't actually going very far. They're only going about 30 miles per day, which seems very reasonable for the battery range availability on the market we have right now for zero emission vehicles. When you look at the big combination trucks at the top of the slide, their daily mileage is quite a bit higher, but not extremely high, right? This is still very much within grasping range for the projected advancements in battery technology in the near future. Next slide. So this is age distribution. We have some pretty old vehicles registered in the state. This isn't too surprising. Medium and heavy duty vehicles are designed and built to last longer than light duty vehicles are. But even so, we do trend toward an older fleet compared to other states in the nation. So nearly half of our medium and heavy duty vehicles are older than 14 years. 16% of them were built before the year 2000. And some of the tailpipe emissions technologies for diesel vehicles that have really cleaned up emissions didn't come online until 2010 or 2014. So a third of our Class 7 and 8 vehicles are older than 20 years. And our 2B through 6 vehicles are on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are spring chickens, only 30% of them less than 5 years old. The study did also look at the top 100 fleets in Colorado in terms of the number of vehicles owned, and nearly half of those are in government fleets, which is a great opportunity for governments to lead by example in this space. We also have a lot of vehicles in utility, truck rental, delivery services, and construction applications that round out that top 100 fleets in the state. And this next section is on policy and program considerations. If you've read the report, this is a pretty comprehensive section of the paper where MJ Bradley did research and catalog a big range of options, from regulation-based approaches to programs and policies and partnerships. You can see kind of the different buckets of strategies that they were able to include. I'll describe a few examples on the next couple of slides, and then we're going to pause quickly for some feedback and audience interaction, because this is, again, one of the meaty sections of the report. So starting with manufacturer sales requirements, the big topic here is the potential adoption of the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule. So this is something that was developed in California, but Colorado has the option to adopt through an Air Quality Control Commission rulemaking, similar to how we adopted the light duty ZEV standards a few years ago. This is a requirement on manufacturers. and it requires the manufacturers to sell an increasing percentage of zero emission vehicles each year in the different weight classes. And there are some flexibilities to trade credits between the vehicle classes. We provided a graph here just to illustrate kind of the order of magnitude we would see in zero emission vehicle sales in Colorado under ACT. This doesn't account for any credit trading, so it is, you know, a pretty coarse estimate. But you can see that the class 2B3 category will have the highest sales requirements, with the class 7 and 8 sales starting to ramp up into the hundreds of vehicles by the end of the decade. A complementary rule to ACT is the low Knox rule. Again, this is something that originated in California under CARB, and Colorado again has the option to adopt this through an AQCC rulemaking. This is also a requirement on the manufacturers, and it requires the manufacturers to improve emissions in the medium and heavy duty vehicles. The goal is a 75% NOx reduction in 2024 and a 90% reduction in 2027. And there are also some other elements that are associated with this rule related to engine testing procedures, warranty, and things like that as well. But beyond just the regulatory approaches of ACT and the low NOx rule, as I mentioned, there are other policy and program opportunities. A few of them outlined here on the slide, but substantially more detail in the report if you're so inclined to dig more into this section. So the first bucket is that procurement policies and programs. This section is really about opportunities to nudge the public and private fleets to purchase these vehicles. So, you know, having fleets lead by example by being early adopters of the technology, assisting them with transition planning so that, you know, they can ramp up from, you know, starting with a couple of vehicles to adding more vehicles to their fleet over time. The next bucket is vehicle incentives and financing. This is really the concept of cash on the hood. How do we bring down the currently higher upfront purchase price, make these vehicles affordable for fleets to purchase today? And, you know, are there ways that we can also incentivize the scrappage of older vehicles, especially those, you know, that we know that those are the most polluting ones on the road? Also thinking about innovative financing programs that we might be able to design. You know, so many fleets are leasing instead of buying. Many fleets are purchasing used vehicles instead of new ones. So we really need to take those things into consideration as we're designing these incentive programs. On the infrastructure side, you know, this is focused on how we could be investing in our statewide charging network to support those trucks that do need to charge out in the wild as opposed to, you know, at their home base. On the utility side, you know, what else can we be doing with utilities to ensure that we can plug in these large vehicles that have, you know, high charge rates, that the local distribution capacity is there to support them when they plug in, and that there are these EV-friendly rate policies so that fleets who are adopting EVs have surety in what that charging is going to cost. In addition to getting vehicles on the road and charging in the ground and utilities on board, you know, the other leg of the stool is really making sure we have that trained technician workforce to operate and service not just the vehicles, but the infrastructure as well. You know, how can we be working with our vocational and technical programs across the state, our community colleges, to really train up the technician workforce and provide continuing education for technicians who are already in the field, but need additional training to know how to handle the new technologies. And then finally, you know, things like local codes that might create low emission or zero emission vehicle only zones. We had a lot of comments in the earlier session today about idle reduction policies, but, you know, really things that can help improve the efficiency of freight deliveries and reduce emissions, especially in crowded downtown areas where it's a little harder for these vehicles to get around sometimes. So now that you have a sense of the various program and policy buckets, I'm going to pause for just a minute so we can get some audience interaction. Mike's going to pull up a poll.
Yes, and we actually have two polls tonight. The first one is just a warm-up to ask people where they're coming from and where they're joining us from today. So take a look at that and please enter your response. I can see the numbers going up. We have about 60% of people have participated. 70. See if we can get to 80 before I close it here. We're right at 75. Almost there. Okay, so right now we have 58% of people tonight are joining us from the Front Range, and we have 5% in the I-70 mountain corridor, and then we have 11% from another part of Colorado, and 26% are people from outside of Colorado. So you share those results, you can look at those. And I will now load up the second poll question, which is about the policy area priority that Kay just talked about. So please take a look at that question. Which policy area do you think is most important for us to focus on? And we'll let those responses come in. We're at 50%. 65%. Try to get up to 80 again here before we close it out. Okay, so let me share these results. So it looks like the leading option is infrastructure planning and investment with 42%. 32% said vehicle incentives and financing. 21% for manufacturer sales requirements, and 5% for additional opportunities. Back to you, Kim.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for participating in that. Interestingly, the numbers do seem to line up between the earlier session and this evening session. So thanks for participating, trying to make it a little more interactive for folks as opposed to me just talking. Although we are in the home stretch now, I promise I only have a few more slides left. So this final section is going to show some modeling results from the MJ Bradley team. Next slide. So they did model 3 scenarios, and they compared those to a baseline business as usual scenario. So the first is adoption of the ACT rule. The second scenario layers in the low Knox rule in addition to ACT. So you see the orange Knox reduction vehicles being added into the chart. And then the final scenario is what we've called the 100 by 40 aspirational scenario. That's a scenario that's going to further accelerate the zero emission vehicle adoption over the next decade compared to the other 2. But this is the most aggressive, and we used it really to illustrate what might be possible if all the stars align exactly perfectly. We have lots of supportive policies in place, and particularly if we can see some coordinated state and federal action such that Colorado isn't going it alone, so to speak, that there really is support on all sides. So the next 3 slides are going to show the expected reductions for various emissions over those 3 scenarios. So this is the first one for greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that there are greenhouse gas benefits with ACT adoption compared to that baseline non-action dotted line scenario. All of these greenhouse gas reductions are important. They do add up. Although you will notice that the reductions are pretty modest through 2030, only about 400,000 tons, with the greater reductions being realized out in the 2050 timeframe, so 3.3 million tons in 2050. If we reach that aspirational scenario, again, you see a little bit more reduction in the near term, but you see about 1 million more tons of reduction out in 2050. Next up is Knox. Again, the same 3 scenarios modeled for Knox. We're looking at a 54% decrease in 2050 under ACT alone, 90% under ACT plus Knox. Not surprising since this is the scenario really targeted at the Knox emissions, and then slightly more reductions under that aspirational scenario. For particulate matter on the next slide, both ACT and ACT plus NOx scenarios show a 53% decrease in particulate matter emissions in 2050 and a 68% decrease under that aspirational scenario. So those past charts were just looking at the emissions. This slide is looking at the projected social value of those emissions reductions across the three pollutants. So the social value for greenhouse gas reductions is using the 2016 US Interagency Working Group figure. And this is a value that's representing the potential cost savings that we would realize from avoiding some of the negative effects of climate change. Things like global temperature rise, drought, wildfires, and the costs that those bear to society. The social value for the NOx and PM reductions is from the EPA COBRA model. And that's a number that's representing the monetized health effects of reduced air pollution. And that's going to be things like reduced hospital and emergency room visits, costs for medical care, things like that. So adding all these together, the cumulative social value of greenhouse gas, NOx, and particulate matter reductions is projected to range from about $11.8 billion in 2050 under the ACT scenario to about $17.1 billion for the aspirational scenario. The next slide is another financial analysis. This one's focused primarily on the cost to fleets. So the initial purchase price of the zero emission vehicle, the purchase price of the associated fueling and charging infrastructure, plus the ongoing operation and maintenance costs for the vehicles and infrastructure. So based on what we talked about earlier with the fact that the technology is not currently at price parity with conventional vehicles, it's not surprising that we see these increased costs in the near term, but we do see those costs projected to come down in the out years, really due to the fact that those initial purchase prices are projected to come down with higher volume manufacturing of the zero emission vehicles, and the fact that the operation and maintenance costs for zero emission vehicles are projected to be quite a bit lower over the life of the vehicle compared to conventional gasoline and diesel technology. This final chart pretty much just adds the last two charts together. So, the social costs, the direct financial costs to fleets, plus utility costs as well. So all the scenarios are projected to result in a net social benefit ranging from $20.2 billion to $26.6 billion, depending on the scenario. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. We've done it in a short time. I'm just going to briefly summarize before we move into public comment. Major takeaways from the study on the next slide. Medium and heavy duty vehicles stick around for a long time. It's important to be thinking about early action because the sooner we can address this, the sooner we have the cleaner vehicles on the road that are going to stay around for a long time. We have a nascent but rapidly growing market. There's a lot of variety, varying levels of readiness. Some sectors like transit, school buses, along with the lighter duty side of the market, that class 2B3 delivery vehicle segment, are the most ready. We do need to see some technology advancement and support for this to be functional and feasible on the heavier side of things, the class 7 and 8 market. We have a good number of vehicles in public fleets. That presents an opportunity for government to lead by example. The modeling results did show the potential for significant greenhouse gas, particulate matter, and NOx reductions, along with cost savings to fleets over time with the adoption of regulatory strategies like ACT and NOx. But we do recognize that we don't have that price parity right now. The initial costs are higher, and fleets are likely going to need help with those higher initial costs in the near term before production scales up and the prices come down with market forces. And obviously, we need to be working together to figure out the best path forward here so that, we're not just forcing trucks out into the market, but really coming together to talk about the benefits and the challenges of this transition. And again, working together to rise to meet that challenge. We want to try to build a complete ecosystem And that includes the vehicles, the charging infrastructure, the fleets, the drivers, the technicians, the utilities, and state programs, and make sure that all of these things are moving in coordination with one another so that we can create that successful ecosystem where these vehicles are going to be successful. So with that, I'm done talking, and I, along with the state team, are going to be moving into listening mode. I know that we have a good cross-section of perspectives represented in the Zoom meeting tonight, and I know we're all anxious to hear your reactions to the study, your thoughts about the path forward. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mike King, who's going to take it from here.
Thank you, Kay. So as Kay just said, we're going to move into the public comment section of the meeting. We have several people that registered in advance to make public comments. So we're going to go down the list in the order that people registered. We're going to ask you to keep your comments under 2 minutes. My colleague Kelly is going to share a countdown clock on the screen so that people can keep track of where they are in their time. And so what I'll do is I'll read the names of the next several people that are going to be up in the queue for comments. And then I will try to give you a little bit of advance notice. I'll allow you to unmute. And when I tell you that you're able to unmute, you should be able to do that on your end and begin your comment. If you would like to make a comment, but you didn't pre-register, please just put that either in the chat or in the Q&A box, or you can even do the raise hand function and we'll get you in the list. So our first 3 people, we have Cindy Copeland from Boulder County. Then we have Aravind Kalis from Volvo Group, followed by Roger Sherwood from Volvo Trucks. I don't know if both of you are going to comment, but let me go find Cindy. Cindy will be first up, and let me see if I can. Okay, I see. There's Roger. Okay, so Roger, you're up next. Cindy, please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi, this is Cindy Copeland. I'm sorry, I'd forgotten that I'd registered to comment.
That's fine. If
way too many rulemakings and hearings going on. I guess I'll just quickly say, so I'm the Air and Climate Policy Analyst for Boulder County, and we definitely support these efforts that the state is taking, and really critical to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we're also really concerned about the continuing ozone problem, and so I think this is a really good opportunity to continue with those efforts.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and thanks for all the great information.
Thank you for your comment.
Thanks.
Next up, we will have Roger Sherwood, and Roger will be followed by Namit Singh, Patricia Portillo, and Jan Rose. So Roger, please go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. I assume you can hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, good. So one of the things that I've learned, and I've been involved in the battery electric vehicle process for a while now, is that when you get to the higher class trucks and when you get to the higher class vehicles, the infrastructure for electric is underpowered, frankly. Is working in Texas and working with the food and fuel people down there. It's interesting how there's a substantial investment that has been made on both the utility side as well as the fueling side, the charging side, in order to make this feasible. So everything I see so far and everything I hear is everyone's always talking about how we need to push this to the manufacturers. But unfortunately, after CNG and LNG and watching how that progressed and living through how that progressed, that the infrastructure was never there. And I fear that that's going to happen on not only battery, but on hydrogen as well. So how does Colorado plan to support their utility companies on that, number one? And then number two, how are they generating the power? I mean, what are the percentages of green power that Colorado is generating? Because I mean, if you're simply moving it out of one yard to another yard, you're not getting anywhere. If you take it out of the tailpipe and put it into the smokestack, you haven't done anything. So that's my last question. Thanks.
Thank you, Roger, for those comments. I think that we can try to address some of those questions in the Q&A portion of the meeting. But for now, we appreciate your comment. Next on the list, I see Namit Singh, but I don't believe that they are with us. Let me look. Next after that, we have Patricia Portillo. Patricio, give me 1 second. Let me read the next few folks so that they're prepared. Jan Rose, followed by Christy Amaro, and then Rudy Vanderwall. So Patricio, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And again, terrific job. I'm really impressed that you guys were able to do 2 of these in one day. You have a great team over there, and it's good to know that we're in good hands with all of the hard work that you all have been doing on this. So now that I've patted you on the back for about 10 seconds of my time, there's 2 items that I wanted to flag from the report. One that really jumped out to me that I thought was interesting was that you utilize a different definition of zero emission vehicles that it's not typically what the industry or stakeholders are familiar with. It's a much more expansive definition of zero emission vehicles. And I encourage you all to narrow that definition to solely focus on vehicles with zero tailpipe emissions. And that's both greenhouse gas and criteria pollutants, rather than using this more expansive definition where you'll still see plenty of tailpipe, potentially still see plenty of tailpipe emissions. One of the key elements to this rule, of course, or the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the Heavy Duty Omnibus Rule, is that you would reduce those in-use emissions, particularly the ones that are harming communities located near freight corridors. So it's really important that we stay focused on zero tailpipe emissions and utilize that definition for zero emission vehicles. The other item that I wanted to note was that it didn't really seem like the report covered some of the labor issues that we know are rampant in the trucking sector. In particular, I'm thinking about truck driver misclassification. And I think part of that speaks to the fact that there's just not a lot of great information on it. So it was probably difficult to collect that data. But that to me really speaks to the need to have the large entity reporting requirement adopted when or considered when Colorado considers adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Rule. That will really help shed a lot of light on who actually are the controlling entities of those vehicles and help address some of these egregious labor violations that we know are occurring. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Patricio. Next on the list is Jan Rose. I don't believe Jan is with us at the moment, so we'll move to Christy Amaro, and after Christy, we will have Rudy Vanderwall and then John Fenton. So Christy, if you're ready to go, please. Oh, did Christy disappear? I saw them. Let's go to Rudy. Rudy, please go ahead with your comment.
Okay, well, I appreciate what you guys have attempted to do here. I guess I've been one that has always liked to see the proof of how we think any of this is actually going to reduce greenhouse gases and ozone depletion in a way that's truly going to be noticeable. You guys showed major savings and money for society. Those are some pretty huge dollars that I think are pretty hard to substantiate. The gentleman that spoke earlier, I think it's very important that what he said gets remembered, that if we're just going to remove emissions from a tailpipe and put them in a smokestack, we're just spending a lot of money and not doing anything. The other thing that's going to happen here is if we choose to follow California down this road, we will just aid in the further slowing of our transportation and all the problems that we're seeing today of, people not getting freight because these things that you guys are looking at us to do in the industry are just not affordable. And what's going to happen is if Colorado adopts this, we're just going to move these companies out of Colorado into another state and follow California down a road of demise, to chase something that there's just so little proof that it's actually going to do good for society, good for the health of people. So.
Thank you for that comment, Rudy. Next on our list is Dawn Fenton. Dawn, you should be ready to begin your comment.
Great. You can hear me okay?
I can, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for holding this session tonight. We're at Volvo Group, we're very excited about this whole transition to zero emission vehicles. We as a company have made a commitment to move to 100% fossil fuel free product offering by 2040, and to actually hit 35% zero emission vehicles by 2030. We're engaged right now in a project in Southern California called the Volvo Lights Project that I won't talk about here, but where we've put several of these Class 8 battery electric vehicles in the hands of fleets, and we've learned a lot through that project. I have to say one of the biggest challenges going forward is that the total cost of ownership for these vehicles are not there now, and they will not be there for a while. They are anywhere from 2 to 3 times more expensive than the diesel equivalent. And even while, and there's lots of things that go into the TCO, including things like the charging rates and the residual value of vehicles that make it difficult. I think the best thing that Colorado can do, and any state can do, to accelerate these in the marketplace is to provide financial incentives, public funded incentives, and also to build out the infrastructure for them. Concern about the California Advanced Clean Truck Regulation is those regulations were based on very specific policies that are in place in California and that fleet makeup, and it doesn't translate to other states directly. The 2 questions I want to note is, you mentioned that the biggest problems in Colorado are your older vehicles in your 2B and 3, and those aren't necessarily going to be addressed by an Advanced Clean Truck Regulation. The other question I had was that the EPA has announced that they're going to promulgate a new clean trucks plan. And with the modeling, it would be interesting to see how many of your pollution or emissions issues will be addressed through that plan.
Thank you, John, for that comment. Okay, next on our list. So we have Katara Barola. Is next on the list. Then after that, Walt Sanders, followed by Steve Douglas. I do not see Katara. So Walt, if you're ready, please begin your comment.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'm Walt Sanders. I'm the owner of RMT Trucking and the current chairman of the Colorado Motor Carriers Association. And we do want to thank you for providing a forum for us to allow to speak, especially myself. I agree that we do need to make some changes to address these emissions. But you know, the trucking industry hasn't just not occurred today. It has evolved over the past 70 years. And so in that meantime, it supported a lot of families and industries in Colorado. And so we just want to make sure people understand that we're here to deliver products and services to the general public, but we need to do it in an economical manner. So some of the issues that we see is that there are still many unknowns, especially in the Class 7 and Class 8 variety of vehicles on new zero emissions. It's making it difficult to decide what type of return on investment that we actually could get. You know, there's the increased price of the vehicles, there's the unknown issues on the miles traveled, and the overall weight of the vehicles is certainly a concern. So technology currently is not readily available for the heavy duty vehicle, as kind of was mentioned earlier by another speaker. We're ready to participate, but it's going to take a while for the equipment to be available. We have one member of our organization who ordered an electric truck a year ago, and it still has not been delivered. So I propose focusing on the lighter categories of vehicles where the technology and equipment is somewhat available, and then find a way to provide some incentives for larger configurations of vehicles. You know, the trucking industry will enhance clean emission vehicles, but have to be available at a reasonable price. Thanks.
Thank you, Walt, for that comment. Next on our list, we have Steve Douglas, followed by Susan Nettle. And then after Susan is Shayna Oliver. So Steve, please go ahead.
Hey, thank you. This is Steve Douglas. Hey, you know, right now the average trucker is 54 years old. So, you know, them of that age of trucker trying to buy a $200,000 truck is not going to happen. And then the gentleman that said that these companies, we convert over like California, people are going to move out. There's more companies moving here because logistics in Colorado roads work. We now have half day, same day delivery. There's huge warehouses being built with 1 million square feet. So, you know, it's only going to increase. We have such a huge influx of people moving here. But if we're going to do this as far as the trucks, the older trucks, you were talking about conversion. So take out the diesel engines and put in electric engines, and Cummins diesel here in Colorado could be a big part of that. So we need to look at that. That right there will cut that emission way down, and, you know, pretty much convert those older trucks over. And not only that, the HOV lanes, those should be converted over so big trucks can use those trucks, because the big trucks can use those HOV lanes. That keeps those big trucks moving and less emissions that are being put into the air, because when they're in the other lanes, they're stop and go. So that should go to the state legislators as well. We need to start looking at different ways, and then take the subsidies from the oil and gas, because that's pretty much has been, you know, handed over to the oil and gas industry. So that needs to go to the trucking companies and for conversions, not only truck companies, for just the average day light truck driver as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Steve. Next on the list, we have Susan Nettle, followed by Shayna Oliver, and then Glenn Cho. Susan, please go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to comment. My name is Susan Nadell, and I'm E2's Mountain States advocate, leading policy and membership in Colorado. I'm here on behalf of E2's network of nearly 800 business leaders in Colorado to express the business community's strong support for Colorado adopting the Advanced Clean Truck Rule and the Heavy Duty Omnibus Rule, which I think you called the NOx rule in next year. So I do want to, before, you know, we feel that we need both the ACT and the federal standard, but we really can't wait for the federal standard. We have a problem right now. We need to start reducing our emissions as soon as we can. And who knows what it will include and when it will be phased in. So we really do advocate for a strong advanced clean truck rule. And as far as the economy, deploying zero emission vehicles is an economic opportunity that would send a powerful market signal to advance continued zero emission investment and innovation by vehicle manufacturers and expand Colorado's already growing clean truck sector. And I love the analysis that you talked about earlier. That was a great presentation. One of the things that's in the report that you didn't mention, that MJ Bradley illustrated, the annual net utility revenue will increase from electric trucks and bus charging, and this increased revenue will be passed directly to customers. And that would could turn into a 2.3% reduction in our utility bills. Kind of the estimate was $70 per customer. So I see it as an economic opportunity, as well as a way to meet our greenhouse gas emission goals. And so we're really excited to see you continue to work on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that comment, Susan. So the last person, oh no, excuse me. The next person on our list is Glenn Cho. And then following Glenn, we have Zachary Kahn. And so Glenn, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can, yes, go ahead.
Yes, hi, my name is Glenn Cho. I'm with Toyota Motors North America. Greatly appreciate holding this webinar tonight. It's very informative. Toyota would like to limit our comments related to the advanced clean truck regulation that Colorado is considering. We have heard various other commenters talk about the economics, and we'd like to more or less focus our comments related to infrastructure. Toyota believes infrastructure is really key to make a heavy-duty, medium-duty ZEV market happen. Without infrastructure, there really is no market. In fact, our comments related to infrastructure are focused on 3 areas. One is availability. Number of stations or charging locations needs to be redundant. Plentiful. Overkill is wonderful. Number 2 is accessibility. A Class 2B truck versus a Class 8 tractor, the accessibility of the site needs to be different. It can't be the same since the vehicles are much larger for Class 8. And number 3 is predictability. Users of these vehicles must be able to have access and predictable experience in order for them to build confidence into these technologies. So we request that Colorado, as part of your adoption or consideration of advanced clean truck regulation, also put forth pathways related to infrastructure development that parallels the regulatory development. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Glenn. So currently the last person on our list is Zachary Kahn with Tesla. If anybody else that's participating tonight who hasn't made a comment would like to get in the queue, please let us know now. Either raise your hand or put something in the chat to say so. And otherwise, we'll go to Zachary.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Perfect. Thanks. So, as you said, my name is Zach Kahn. I'm with Tesla. Really appreciate the work that went into not only putting this report together, but having these sessions. I think they're really invaluable and appreciate the time today. First off, I think my colleague earlier spoke a little bit about, in the first session, a little bit about the infrastructure. So I'll move on to some other issues. I wanted to start with first echoing what Patricio started out with on the ZEVs and really focusing on the definition to really focus on tailpipe emissions. So that's first and foremost. And then, on the ACT front, I just wanted to say, I think it's important to think about what the ACT will do to operators, will do for operators in Colorado. The ACT rule will by its very nature encourage electric truck manufacturers or any truck manufacturers offering electric vehicles to focus more time, energy, and resources on selling trucks to operators in Colorado. This will not only help to accelerate the adoption of these trucks, but it's also going to ensure that operators in Colorado will have ample supply of electric trucks of all classes available for truck operators, which is really important because having that supply and knowing if Colorado is not adopting ACT, you can see a lot of the supply being focused on ACT states. So it's important, it's critical for operators in California that they do have access to those vehicles so that they can convert their fleets to zero emission. Tesla is excited to bring our Tesla Semi to the market in 2023. And we are excited to demonstrate that all electric trucks can have ranges up to 500 miles plus and can operate on virtually any duty cycle when combined with the megawatt charging system that Tesla and the industry are currently developing. I look forward to working with the state on this effort and appreciate the time tonight.
Thank you, Zachary, for that comment. And thank you to all the participants that made a comment this evening. We're now moving to the next portion of the agenda. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will come back, do some question and answer with the panelists. So please feel free to take those 5 minutes. If you have a question that you'd like to put in the Q&A box, please add that ahead of time. And then Kelly, if you can put up a 5-minute timer, and then we'll plan to reconvene back here shortly. Thank you. Okay. So our 5-minute break is up, and we're going to transition to the question and answer portion of the meeting. We've gotten some questions submitted that I will read to our panelists. If the panelists want to turn on their video so they can respond to these. The first question, let me just pull it up here. So the first question is for Kay Kelly. And the question is, where did you get your average truck age that was referred to in the study?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So that's a stat that comes from the Transportation Energy Data Book, and that's a resource that's issued annually by Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Okay, thank you. The next question is directed toward Steve McCannon with CDPHE. So this is referring to in the slides, the emissions measures. Are these measures tailpipe emissions only?
Thanks, Mike. These are life cycle emissions, which include tailpipe and upstream emissions. MJ Bradley's analysis shows life cycle emissions for the entire medium heavy duty fleet over time. This study looked at the entire medium and heavy duty fleet through 2050 and replaced ICE vehicles with EVs and fuel cell EVs over time. This is why we see tailpipe emissions throughout their analysis.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is for Will Tor with the Colorado Energy Office. So can you talk about Colorado's plans in terms of battery recycling?
Yes, happy to. So the state does not currently have firm plans for battery recycling, but this is a fast developing area. The Department of Public Health and Environment recently completed a battery recycling study. Of note, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act includes both significant funding for research and development on battery recycling and $110 million in grant funding that state and local governments can apply to for deployment. There may also be opportunities for second life options for batteries, including for use in stationary electricity storage. There's some interesting developments. For instance, a recent study also suggests that recycling can be good for batteries, that cells using recycled cathode materials actually may last substantially longer than cells with virgin materials.
Thank you, Will. Okay, the next question, this looks like it's also for Will. So it's a question about the current electricity generation breakdown in Colorado, i.e. what is the percent coal versus natural gas versus renewables?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. And the grid in Colorado is transforming very rapidly. Colorado used to have a coal-dominated grid, and that's no longer the case. Right now, renewables and natural gas make up over half of Colorado's generation mix. And legislation adopted in 2019 and then added to in 2021 requires Colorado's utilities to reduce their GHG emissions by a minimum of 80% below 2005 levels by 2030. Notably, the Public Utilities Commission is currently evaluating the electric resource plan submitted by our two largest utilities, Xcel Energy and Tri-State Generation and Transmission. Xcel's proposed plan would achieve an 85% emissions reduction by 2030 and approximately an 80% renewable share, with the vast majority of the remaining generation being through natural gas. Tri-State is planning to retire every coal plant they have in Colorado by 2030 and replace that with renewables. Platte River Power Authority and Colorado Springs Utilities, our two large municipal utilities, have already adopted electric resource plans that will retire all coal generation in the state by 2030. Platte River's ERP achieves a 90% pollution reduction by 2030. Holy Cross Energy is committed to 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030. And Black Hills Energy has no coal generation. Their generation is already all gas and renewables, and they will be submitting a clean energy plan to achieve at least an 80% reduction by 2030. Together, these utilities represent more than 99% of fossil generation in the state. Additionally, the governor has set a goal of 100% clean electricity generation by 2040. So certainly by the time that we have a significant fleet of medium and heavy duty electric vehicles on the road, we will have an extremely low GHG, low carbon grid powering Colorado.
Thank you, Will. This next question, this may also be for Will, is what are Colorado's plans to invest in infrastructure to support this transition?
Yeah, happy to discuss that. So Colorado has a number of significant funding sources for infrastructure, notably Senate Bill 260, which was approved by the legislature and signed by the governor in June, creates 3 new transportation electrification enterprises that collectively will have approximately $730 million in new fee revenue to invest in transportation electrification over the next decade. The funds don't sunset at the end of the decade. They'll continue to grow beyond that. One of the enterprises, the community access enterprise, is dedicated primarily to charging and fueling infrastructure, so EV charging infrastructure and hydrogen fueling infrastructure. In addition, there is an existing Colorado Electric Vehicle Fund, which is projected to have approximately $115 million to invest in EV infrastructure over the decade. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act also makes additional funding available. CDOT is projected to get $57 million in formula funds for charging infrastructure over the next 5 years and is eligible to apply for grants from a new $2.5 billion electric vehicle charging fund. In addition, in 2019, the legislature passed Senate Bill 19077, which creates requirements for regulated electric utilities to develop transportation electrification plans that will support widespread electrification of transportation. The first one of those was approved earlier this year by our Public Utilities Commission, approximately $105 million of investment in programs and infrastructure, but primarily infrastructure by Xcel Energy over the next 3 years. And they are required by law to submit new plans every 3 years. So there will be 2 more full funding cycles or full TEP cycles before the end of the decade. And the way that the legislation is structured, the cost caps grow over time as the revenue from electric vehicle charging grows. So we would anticipate larger investments over time. So there's a significant amount of funding available for infrastructure investment. There's certainly important work to do in coordinating that funding. One important opportunity coming up is that the community access enterprise will be developing its 10-year investment plan over the next year. By statute, it is required to be completed by next June, and would certainly encourage folks who have input on how we should be programming those infrastructure funds to provide input on the development of that 10-year plan.
Will. The next question is for Kay. So is it really better to create emissions and larger trash dumps with batteries than to burn fuel that is already available?
Yeah, so good question. And while zero emission vehicles do produce life cycle emissions in terms of how they're manufactured, the electricity that they use, and the eventual recycling of the batteries, there have been a lot of studies that show that these emissions are actually lower than those of internal combustion engines, again, accounting for that full life cycle of manufacturing, fuel production, fuel use, and then eventual recycling of an internal combustion engine vehicle. As Will mentioned earlier, battery recycling is currently challenging. We aren't envisioning that these batteries are going to be, stacking up in landfills. We do know that the batteries need to be recycled, and there is a lot of research happening at the National Renewable Energy Lab here in Colorado and a lot of the other national labs as well and universities. And they're really making some good progress toward that circular economy for the recycling of battery components. The good news is that, it's been shown that batteries are highly recyclable. And that is a pretty big distinction from fossil fuels where, as you mentioned, you extract that fuel from the ground and you burn it and it goes into the atmosphere. And you can't get that carbon back the same way that you can recycle the materials in a battery, get that back, put it into a new battery, and actually have that second battery perform superior to the original battery. So that is a pretty big distinction.
Thank you, Kay. The next question is for Steve McCannon with CDPHE. And so this question is, Steve, how can the state of Colorado pay for all of this?
Good question, Mike. We're very fortunate here in the state right now to have quite a bit of funding out there for these efforts. We've got substantial funding within the Colorado Energy Office, CDOT, CDPHE. And then we've got our existing programs of Alt Fuels Colorado, Charge Ahead Colorado, our DC fast charging plaza programs. As Will indicated, we've got $700 million coming down over the next 10 years for within our enterprises for charging stations, vehicles, and transit buses. And then there are a lot of utility programs popping up, investing in charging infrastructure, technical assistance, and pilot programs. Another exciting piece that just came out in the last week is the new proposal in the governor's budget for $150 million in electric school buses and $15 million for cleaner diesel trucks. And then we are awaiting word on all the funding that's going to come down from the federal government and more to come on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, let me just look at the list here. We have a question. Oh, sorry, just lost myself there a second. So there's a question here. I don't know if this is a good one for Kay maybe, but to talk about the average rate per kilowatt hour. Do we have any information about how people would be charged or paying for this electricity?
Yeah, so it'll depend on whether vehicles are charging at a depot and paying the electric rates from the utility, or whether they're charging at a public charging station. Those rates will differ based on where the charge is happening. For those fleets that do have the opportunity to charge at a depot, fleets would typically pay a per kilowatt hour charge as well as any demand charges. And those rates are going to vary by service area. Some utilities already do have EV specific rates for commercial businesses that have fleets running electric vehicles. And those rates are more tailored to that charging of medium and heavy duty vehicle scenario. But that is one of the policy items that that was mentioned during the presentation is, how we can be continuing to work with utilities so that they're offering those competitive rates for fleets that are charging vehicles in addition to the regular electricity usage that their business has.
Thanks, Kay. I think we had a follow-up for Will on the question about the utility mix in Colorado. Can you explain that? So can you break it down between natural gas versus renewables for the mix today?
Yes, for today's mix, it's approximately 30% renewables, 34% natural gas, and 36% coal. But again, trending towards virtually all of the coal being retired by the end of the decade and replaced primarily with renewables backed up by natural gas combustion turbines in some cases, but that have very low capacity factors, so that virtually all of the additional energy will come from renewables.
Great, Thank you, Will. And then another question that I think you might be able to help with, or anyone on the panel, but in Colorado, can electricity be sold via a resale network, or is it only sold directly from the utility companies?
I can speak to that. So in general, electricity can only be sold by the utility in whose service territory you're located. However, there's legislation in Colorado that states that resale of electricity for the purposes of electric vehicle charging is allowed, and you are not considered a utility that's in competition with, the main utility service provider if you're reselling electricity for the purposes of EV charging.
Got it. Okay. Well, I'm looking at the Q&A here, and I believe that we've addressed all of these questions, but I would definitely encourage anyone on the call who wants to follow up or has additional questions that we didn't get to, please send those to, we're going to share an email address. Let me pull up the slides again. We have an email address for this effort, and we're happy to answer any additional questions. So let me move this forward. Right, so you can see there how to stay involved moving forward in this effort. So this is the second of 3 public meetings that we're holding this month. The third one will be on November 20th, which is a Saturday in the morning. So please, if you'd like to participate in that or encourage others to do so, please point them in that direction. We have the option to submit public comments or general questions to cleantruckstrategy@state.co.us. We also have a web page that we'll send out after this meeting, and that I believe might appear on the last page here, the last slide. As we move forward, you can see, as Kay pointed out previously, that we're midway through this process. We have some other dates coming up in terms of drafting the strategy, finalizing, and then that potential rulemaking if it moves forward in 2022. So this will not be the last opportunity for involvement in the clean trucking strategy. And yes, this is the website that I mentioned. If you see there, the ongoing updates, we will post the slides from this meeting, we'll post recordings. We'll also update our frequently asked questions to address some of the things that were raised today and in our previous meeting. And we welcome all written comments and questions, requests for additional outreach at cleantruckstrategy@state.co.us. So with that, I will turn it back to Kay, Will, and the other panelists if they have any closing words for us tonight.
I'll hop in first. So again, just want to thank you for taking time out of your evening to provide feedback on the study and to share your opinions with us. We've had a great diversity of comments over the course of the 2 meetings today, and we certainly appreciate that, and we'll be taking those into consideration. I also do want to recognize the state team. Not in addition to the folks you see on camera, there are a bunch of other folks in the background who have helped to make this meeting run smoothly in their evening as well. So thank you very much to the team who makes this webinar possible. And then I'll hand it over to Will.
Thank you, Kay. I'd also just like to thank everybody for their participation this evening. As we move forward towards developing and finalizing the clean trucking strategy and move towards potential rulemakings in the spring, it's incredibly valuable to hear the diverse perspectives from stakeholders and from industry representatives. So thank you for your participation tonight, and look forward to continued participation as the clean trucking strategy moves forward.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.